there is a box, a small, unremarkable box, the kind you'd find in the back of any funeral home storage closet, gathering dust between old paperwork and spare equipment. Inside it sits a pair of rubber gloves, a set of forceps, lip brushes, aneurysm hooks, arterial tubes, and one plastic toe tag, the kind that gets clipped to a gurney, except this one doesn't have a name on it. It just says John Doe. For 33 years, that box sat in silence, untouched, unseen, unspoken of, because the one man who knew exactly what it meant had made a decision. He was not going to talk, not to reporters, not to biographers, not to the millions of fans who, for 3 decades, kept asking the same question over and over again. What really happened to Elvis Presley in that preparation room on the night of August 16, 1977? And when that man finally broke his silence, in 2010, he didn't sit down for an interview. He didn't write a tell-all memoir. He tried to sell the box. And when a reporter finally caught up with him and asked him, point blank, what he saw that night, what he really saw, he gave one sentence. People deserve to know the truth. And then he said nothing else, ever again. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why that one unfinished sentence has haunted Elvis historians for over a decade, and why in the year 2027, a sealed vault of documents is finally set to answer the question he refused to. Welcome back, everyone. If this is your first time here, we dig into the darkest, most tightly sealed corners of history's biggest mysteries, and today we are tackling one of the most enduring, most emotionally loaded deaths in American pop culture. And I want to be upfront with you about something before we even get started. This isn't one of those stories where we're going to hand you a neat, tidy conclusion at the end, tied up with a bow. This is a story about what happens when the official record and the physical evidence don't line up, and about what people do, what they build, what they believe, when the truth gets locked behind a door for 50 years. So if you're the type of viewer who likes clean answers, fair warning, you're not going to get one today. What you are going to get is every documented fact we have, laid out in order, so you can draw your own conclusions right alongside me. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died at Graceland. Within hours, the Shelby County medical examiner stood in front of a bank of television cameras and told the world, with total confidence, that the king of rock and roll died of cardiac arrhythmia. No drugs involved. Case closed, or so it seemed. But weeks later, when the full toxicology results finally came back from the lab, they told a completely different story. 14 different drugs in his system. Codeine at 10 times the normal therapeutic level. That same night, before the ink on the death certificate was even dry, Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, made a decision that would echo for the next 50 years. He sealed the complete autopsy file, locked it away, made it inaccessible to journalists, historians, researchers, everyone, until the year 2027. And the man who embalmed the body, the man who stood alone in a preparation room with the king of rock and roll in the dead of night, the man who saw things that the sanitized public narrative never accounted for, took his own private box of evidence and disappeared into silence for 33 years. This is that story. Buckle up, because it gets stranger with every layer we peel back. Let's rewind the clock, though, because to understand just how shocking that final collapse really was, you need to understand what the hours before it actually looked like. This wasn't a man on death's door. This wasn't someone who seemed to be circling the drain. Quite the opposite, actually. And that's part of what makes this whole story so unsettling. Around midnight on August 15th, Elvis Presley returned to Graceland from a late-night dental appointment. He was, by every account from the people who were there, energized, upbeat, talking about the upcoming tour dates with genuine excitement. He gathered up his cousin Billy Smith and Billy's wife Jo, and the three of them headed out to the estate's private racquetball court at around midnight. Think about that for a second. This is a man just hours away from one of the most famous deaths in American history, and he's out on a racquetball court in the middle of the night, moving with a restless, familiar energy that, by every witness account, defied any obvious sign of physical decline. After a competitive match, Elvis sat down at the piano in the court's lounge, and here's where it gets almost hauntingly poetic. He started filling the room with gospel harmonies. He played Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. It was quiet, it was domestic, it was intimate, shared only with the people he trusted most in the world. As the music faded out around 2 in the morning, Elvis looked ahead, mentally, to the heavy schedule waiting for him. He told Billy that the upcoming tour, set to kick off the very next day, was going to be his best one yet. His best one yet. Sit with that phrase for a second, because within hours he would be gone. For the family inside Graceland that night, there was no shadow, no warning sign, no impending sense of crisis. Just a warm, quiet optimism about what was coming next. That's the tragedy underneath the tragedy here. Nobody saw it coming, or at least, nobody who was in that room that night has ever claimed that they did. And that's part of what makes this case so different from the way we usually think about celebrity deaths. We're used to stories that build slowly, where in hindsight, everyone can point to the warning signs, the missed shows, the erratic behavior, the visible decline. But that's not really what the people closest to Elvis describe about those final hours. They describe a man laughing at the piano, planning his next tour, sounding, by every account, like someone who fully expected to see the sunrise the next day, and the day after that, and every day after that for years to come. Now fast forward. It's the afternoon of August 16th, 1977, 2:30, and the quiet inside Graceland shatters, all at once, without warning. Ginger Alden walks into the second-floor master bathroom, and what she finds there changes American music history forever. Elvis Presley, slumped face down on the floor, near the toilet, completely unresponsive, completely still. When the Memphis Fire Department paramedics arrived, racing against the clock, after that 2:33 p.m. emergency call, something strange happened. Something that, frankly, still unsettles people who study this case closely. They did not immediately recognize the patient. Let that sink in for a moment. This is Elvis Presley, arguably the most photographed, most recognizable human being on the planet at that point in history, and the first responders who arrived on scene could not immediately confirm who they were looking at. Why? Because the physical trauma of his sudden collapse had drastically altered his features. His skin was heavily bruised, discolored, showing dark purplish tones. His face was severely swollen. For those first responders, the extreme post-mortem discoloration and swelling made visual identification nearly impossible in those frantic opening minutes. They began chest compressions immediately, working against time, but the body's condition already suggested something the family desperately didn't want to hear: that he had likely been gone for some time already. These severe physical changes did more than just end the emergency response. They kicked off one of the most highly contested public mysteries in American entertainment history. And they also set the stage, quite literally, for the immense cosmetic and structural nightmare that the senior embalmer at the Memphis funeral home would have to confront alone later that night, in the quiet of an empty preparation room. But before we get to him, let's talk about what the public was actually told, because this is where the story starts splitting into two completely different realities. At Baptist Memorial Hospital, Shelby County Medical Examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco stepped in front of a wall of reporters and delivered what would become the official, headline-grabbing explanation for Elvis Presley's death: cardiac arrhythmia. A sudden, irregular heartbeat caused by hypertensive heart disease. And then, almost as an aside, but one that would echo for decades, Francisco went further. He explicitly told the cameras that there was no evidence of drug intoxication. No evidence. Full stop. Case closed, at least in the eyes of the public that watched that broadcast in real time. Here's the problem, and this is the part that should make your eyebrows go up. That statement, that definitive, camera-ready conclusion, was delivered weeks before the laboratory toxicology work was even complete. He told the entire country a conclusion before the actual evidence had come back from the lab. And when the final toxicology panels did return, they painted a fundamentally different picture. 14 distinct prescription drugs circulating through his system at the time of death: morphine, Valium, Demerol, and most alarming of all, codeine, registering at roughly 10 times the standard therapeutic level. 10 times. Think about the disconnect here. The public had been told, on camera with total confidence, that drugs played no role whatsoever. But the actual scientific data, once it finally came in, revealed a massive burden of central nervous system depressants in his bloodstream. This is the moment where the official narrative and the private clinical reality split apart permanently, and where the seeds of 5 decades of speculation were quietly planted. So where did all these drugs actually come from? This is where we meet a man who would become almost as infamous in certain circles as Elvis himself. His name was Dr. George Nicopolis. Inside the Graceland inner circle, everyone just called him Dr. Nick. In the final 8 months of 1977 alone, Dr. Nick issued 199 separate prescriptions for Elvis Presley, totaling more than 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics. Let that number roll around in your head for a second. 10,000 doses in 8 months for one patient. This staggering volume became the focal point of a widening investigation into exactly how the most famous entertainer on the planet ended up dead at the age of 42. In 1980, a grand jury indicted Dr. Nicopolis, charging him with overprescribing addictive substances, not just to Presley, but to other patients as well. The 1981 criminal trial that followed became a genuine spectacle. Prosecutors laid out the sheer volume, thousands upon thousands of pills, as evidence of dangerous, reckless malpractice. The defense, on the other hand, argued something almost paradoxical, that Dr. Nick was actually trying to control his patients' severe pre-existing addictions by managing the supply himself, rather than let Elvis obtain drugs from less careful sources. It's a defense that walks a strange, uncomfortable line, and the jury, in the end, bought it. They acquitted him on all counts. But here's the twist. That courtroom victory did not end the scrutiny, not even close. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners opened its own, completely separate inquiry into his clinical conduct, and on July 19, 1995, nearly 2 decades after Elvis died, the board permanently revoked Dr. Nicopolis's medical license. They found him guilty of gross malpractice and unethical conduct, involving 13 separate patients, Elvis Presley among them. So think about the strange split decision outcome here. A criminal court found him not guilty, but a state medical board, examining the exact same underlying behavior years later, stripped him of the ability to practice medicine at all, permanently tying his professional legacy to the death of the world's biggest star. Justice, in this case, arrived twice in 2 completely different forms, almost 2 decades apart. And personally, when I look at that gap between acquittal and license revocation, that's where I think the real answer to what happened to Elvis quietly lives. Not in one dramatic verdict, but in that slow, grinding, bureaucratic recognition that something had gone deeply wrong, administered one prescription at a time. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about cases like this one. Criminal courts are built to answer a very narrow question. Did this specific person commit this specific crime beyond a reasonable doubt? Medical boards ask a completely different question. Was this person fit, in a broader, ongoing sense, to hold the responsibility of prescribing medication to human beings at all? And when you look at those 2 answers side by side, not guilty in one room, permanently unfit in the other, you start to realize that the full truth about Dr. Nick was probably never going to fit inside a single verdict anyway. Now let's talk about the vault. Because on the night of August 16th, while the rest of the world was still absorbing the shock of losing Elvis Presley, Vernon Presley, grieving, overwhelmed, and facing a level of media scrutiny that no father should ever have to face, made a decision that would permanently alter the historical record. He ordered the complete autopsy and toxicology files sealed, every page, every photograph, every laboratory log, locked away, out of public reach for 50 years. 50 years. With an official release date scheduled for 2027. Think about what that means. A private family decision made in a moment of raw grief transformed a medical record into something closer to a sealed vault, a locked door that an entire nation has been standing outside of for decades, speculating about what's behind it. In 1982, the Tennessee Supreme Court actually upheld this arrangement, ruling definitively that the public had no legal right to see the file. For researchers, journalists, biographers, anyone trying to piece together the real story of what happened to Elvis Presley, this 50-year seal created an enormous historical gap. The original pathology reports, the photographs, the laboratory logs, all of it completely inaccessible. Every single argument, every theory, every documentary, every book written about Elvis's death since 1977 has had to rely entirely on secondary documents and public statements because the primary source material has simply never been available. And here's the thing that I find genuinely fascinating about this. Vernon's decision to seal that file happened before any conspiracy theories had even taken shape. He built a wall of total privacy first, and the mystery, the myths, the wild theories, all of that grew up afterward. inside the vacuum that wall created. In a strange way, the secrecy didn't just protect the family, it manufactured the mystery. Think about how differently this story might have unfolded if that file had simply been made public in 1978. Maybe the 14 drugs and the codeine level would have made headlines for a few weeks, then faded, just another sad footnote in the story of a star who burned too hot for too long. Instead, by sealing it, Vernon Presley accidentally created the single most valuable piece of unopened evidence in celebrity death history, one that has now outlived him, outlived Dr. Nick, and will very likely outlive most of the people watching this video right now before it's finally cracked open in 2027. Okay, now we get to the part of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it's the part that I personally find the most haunting of the entire case. At 10 minutes past 8 on the evening of August 16th, a hearse quietly transferred Elvis Presley's body from Baptist Memorial Hospital to the Memphis Funeral Home on Union Avenue. And inside that preparation room, waiting for him, was a senior embalmer facing what might be the most difficult, most high-pressure cosmetic and reconstructive challenge of his entire career. The trauma from the fatal collapse, combined with the deeply invasive nature of the autopsy itself, had left the body severely swollen and discolored. Dark, purplish bruising covered the face. Features that had defined an entire generation of American music, that had appeared on magazine covers and movie posters and record sleeves for over 2 decades, were now heavily distorted, barely recognizable. And for the next several hours, working almost entirely alone, in near total isolation, that embalmer had to prepare the king of rock and roll for a scheduled public viewing that would draw the eyes of the entire world. Picture that scene for a moment. It's the middle of the night. The rest of the country is reeling, radio stations are interrupting their programming, television networks are scrambling to put together tribute specials. And in one quiet, sterile room in Memphis, one man stands over the body of the most famous entertainer alive, entirely alone, with the responsibility of somehow bridging the gap between a brutal, undignified private death and the polished, public spectacle that thousands upon thousands of mourners were about to demand. The process required far more than standard preservation work. The embalmer began with arterial injections of preservative fluids, stabilizing the tissue, a procedure that naturally leaves skin with a firm, slightly waxy texture, something we'll come back to in a moment, because it matters more than you'd think. Then came the delicate, almost artistic task of full reconstruction. Elvis's famous jet black hair had started to show its natural gray underneath, so the embalmer applied a fresh coat of dark dye. Then came heavy layers of specialized mortuary cosmetics and lip paint, carefully applied to mask the deep post-mortem discoloration and restore something resembling a natural living skin tone. By dawn on August 17th, the work was done. Through a combination of precise arterial chemistry and what can only be described as genuine cosmetic artistry, this one man had somehow bridged the gap between a traumatic, chaotic private death and the massive, highly public spectacle that was already assembling itself at the gates of Graceland. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. When the work in that preparation room was finally finished, the embalmer did not simply clean up and dispose of his equipment like any other night. Instead, he gathered up the tools he had used during those quiet, isolated hours, the rubber gloves, the forceps, the lip brushes, the aneurysm hooks, the arterial tubes, and he placed them deliberately inside a container. Among those items was that plastic toe tag I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, the one that read John Doe. And here's a detail that genuinely gives me chills every time I go back over this case. Earlier that same evening, a fan had somehow slipped past security and stolen the original identification tag right off the gurney. To maintain some kind of administrative order in the chaos, mortuary staff attached this replacement tag, this nameless, generic John Doe tag, to the body of the single most famous entertainer on the planet. For a few surreal hours, the king of rock and roll was, quite literally, in official paperwork terms, no one at all. The mortician also held onto the preparation room case report, the case sheet, and the coffin shipping invoice, wrapping the entire collection together in a single box. And for 33 years, that box remained hidden, completely removed from public view. The embalmer chose absolute, total silence, keeping these instruments locked away as his own private, physical archive of that night. Now I want you to think about this for a second, because on the surface, These are just ordinary mortuary tools, designed for brief, practical, forgettable utility. And yet, their physical existence, hidden away for over 3 decades, carries this strange, haunted weight to it. They don't provide written explanations. They don't solve a single medical mystery on their own. But they are tangible, physical remnants of the exact, precise reality of that night. The rubber that touched the skin, the steel that held the tissue, the anonymous tag that briefly replaced a household name known around the entire world. In my opinion, that box says more about the psychological weight of that night than almost any official document ever could. Because a man doesn't quietly preserve a box of tools for 33 years unless something about that night genuinely stayed with him. By the afternoon of August 17th, the private, quiet morning inside Graceland dissolved completely into a massive national spectacle. More than 30,000 people lined the streets outside, standing for hours in stifling summer heat that pushed past 90 degrees, all just waiting for a brief, fleeting glimpse of the singer. To prevent an outright riot, 300 Tennessee National Guard troops took up positions along the gates, setting up metal detectors, and doing everything they could to manage a crowd that was, by every account, teetering on the edge of chaos. Inside, the quiet grand foyer of Graceland transformed into a full ceremonial hall. Directly beneath the crystal chandelier, Elvis Presley lay in state inside a 900-pound solid copper Promethean casket. That heavy metal coffin, shipped in specially from Oklahoma, lent this incredible, solemn weight to the room, cementing the transition of what had once been a private family home into what would become, permanently, a public shrine. And then, during that private viewing, something happened that, frankly, still shocks people when they hear it for the first time. A member of the Presley family betrayed the family's trust in the most public way imaginable. The National Enquirer paid Elvis's own cousin, Billy Mann, $18,000 to smuggle a miniature camera into the foyer. Mann managed to capture a single frame of the singer lying in the casket. That photograph, published on the September 6th cover of the National Enquirer, became the best-selling tabloid issue in American publishing history, selling 6.5 million copies. Let that sink in. Private, family grief, at its most intimate and painful moment, was smuggled out, sold, and turned into a mass-marketed commodity almost overnight. And instead of offering the public any sense of closure, that image did the exact opposite. It sparked decades of intense, relentless speculation. Millions of readers fixated on 2 details in that grainy photograph: the body's waxy skin and what looked like a strangely displaced hairline. Now, as we already covered, these features were the completely standard, expected results of post-mortem cosmetic reconstruction, the exact same process that any embalmer would have used on any body that had suffered similar trauma. But context rarely survives contact with a tabloid headline. These visual oddities in the casket photograph quickly fused together with another, completely separate piece of Elvis lore that had been floating around for years already. The Honorary Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge that President Richard Nixon personally gave Elvis during a private Oval Office meeting back in December of 1970. Now, federal records are actually very clear about what that badge was: a ceremonial token, a symbolic gift, carrying absolutely no legal authority whatsoever. But believers, over time, transformed that harmless souvenir into something else entirely. Proof, in their minds, of a secret double life as some kind of government agent. And here's where the theory really takes flight, in the strangest possible direction. In this version of events, the waxy, oddly hairline corpse in that casket photograph wasn't Elvis at all. It was a decoy. And the real singer, according to this theory, had entered a federal witness protection program to escape some unnamed, unspecified threat. Think about the sheer logical leap required here. An honorary, ceremonial gesture from a sitting president gets reinterpreted, decades later, as a real security credential, and a simple, well-meaning souvenir becomes the entire foundation of a modern American myth. And honestly, when you trace the psychology of it, it makes a strange kind of sense. Without access to the verified, sealed records, this rumors-as-evidence logic simply rushed in to fill the vacuum that Vernon Presley's decision had created 3 years earlier. People weren't given real answers, so they built their own. Inside Graceland's music room, meanwhile, the private grief of the Presley family transitioned into something far more structured and ceremonial. Celebrities like Anne Margaret, James Brown, and George Hamilton joined the mourners gathered around that solid copper casket. But outside the gates, the private farewell had already exploded into an unprecedented public event. An estimated 80,000 spectators lined the streets of Memphis, standing under the brutal August sun as the white hearse began its slow, deliberate procession toward Forest Hill Cemetery. And this is where the story takes one more devastating turn, one that rarely gets mentioned in most retellings of this saga. Along that crowded roadside, in the middle of this massive, sprawling public tribute, a drunk driver lost control of his vehicle. He struck 3 teenage mourners. 2 of them died. In the middle of mourning one tragic, sudden death, this massive civic procession produced 2 more. The burial did not deliver the quiet closure everyone was desperately hoping for. Instead, it left behind fresh trauma, fresh grief, and fresh stories that the press would keep chasing for years afterward. But even after the burial, even after the funeral, even after millions of mourners went home, Graceland's story of strange, unsettling twists was far from over. 11 days after the burial, security at Forest Hill Cemetery completely fell apart. On August 29th, police arrested 3 men inside the cemetery grounds, charging them with attempting to break into the marble crypt itself. Rumors spread almost instantly that the men had planned to steal Elvis's body and hold it for a $10 million ransom. It sounds almost too dramatic to be real, and here's where it gets even stranger. Years later, a former deputy sheriff named Billy Talley came forward and claimed that the entire break-in had actually been staged. According to Talley, it was Vernon Presley himself who orchestrated the fake intrusion specifically to create a justification for relocating his son's remains to the far more secure grounds of Graceland itself. Now, local authorities have never officially confirmed this particular claim, but here's the interesting part. Shortly after that break-in, the state did grant the family permission to move the body, and that's exactly how Elvis ended up buried behind the gates of his own mansion, in the meditation garden, where his grave remains to this day. Staged or not, the timing is undeniably convenient, and if you ask me, that's exactly the kind of detail that keeps this whole story alive 50 years later. Nothing about it ever quite adds up cleanly. Now let's come back to our embalmer, because his story doesn't end in that preparation room in 1977. It resurfaces again, decades later, in a way nobody expected. In 2010, now in his 80s, the man who had spent 33 years in complete silence finally broke that silence. But not in the way you'd expect from someone sitting on this level of historical intrigue. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't sit down for a tell-all documentary. Instead, he attempted to sell his private archive. Through Leslie Heinemann auctioneers in Chicago, he listed the entire box, the mortuary instruments, the replacement John Doe toe tag, all of it, for public sale, with a total estimated value of $14,000. Think about that valuation for a second. $14,000 for a box of objects that had spent over 3 decades locked in complete secrecy, tied directly to the death of one of the most famous human beings of the 20th century. It's almost absurdly modest, given the weight of what those objects represent. But the auction never actually happened. On July 23, 2010, the Memphis Funeral Home's legal team stepped in and filed a formal objection, claiming legal ownership of the artifacts, and effectively forcing the auction house to cancel the entire event. The instruments were returned to the funeral home, and once again, they were locked away in private storage, out of public reach. But before he faded back into obscurity, before this brief strange chapter closed for good, the embalmer gave one single brief statement to a reporter who had managed to track him down. He said that people deserve to know the truth about what happened in that preparation room on that night. And then he stopped talking. He never explained what that truth actually was. Not one more sentence, not one more detail. He simply disappeared from public view again, taking whatever he actually witnessed that night with him, and leaving the final private hours of the world's most famous entertainer forever bound to the secrets of that quiet, isolated room. And I think that's really the detail that sticks with me the most out of this entire case. Not the drugs, not the trial, not even the sealed autopsy file. It's that one unfinished sentence from a man who had absolutely nothing left to gain by lying and nothing left to lose by finally telling the truth, and who still, even then, chose to say almost nothing at all. Why would someone hold on to a secret for 33 years, only to hint at its existence and then walk away again? Is it professional discretion, the kind of quiet, old-school code that funeral home workers of that era were trained to live by? Or is it something heavier? Something he genuinely believed the world wasn't ready to hear, or that he himself never fully processed? We don't know. And honestly, we may never know, at least not from him directly, because as far as public records show, he never spoke publicly about it again before his story faded from the headlines entirely. So where does that leave us today? As we approach the year 2027, when that 50-year seal on the autopsy and toxicology files is finally set to lift, the line between public myth and private medical reality remains as fiercely contested as it was back in 1977. Every theory we've talked about today, the sealed files, the mismatched public statements, the 10,000 doses in 8 months, the waxy skin in that stolen photograph, the honorary badge turned secret identity, the staged cemetery break-in, the silent embalmer and his hidden box, all of it exists in the same strange, unresolved space. A space created almost entirely by one grieving father's decision to lock a door 50 years ago and never fully explain why. My honest, personal take, after digging through all of this, I don't think there's a secret government conspiracy hiding behind that vault door. I think what's actually behind it is something far more human, and honestly, far sadder. A tired, over-medicated 42-year-old man, surrounded by people who loved him but who also, in their own ways, enabled the very thing that killed him. A doctor who prescribed enough drugs to sedate a small hospital ward, believing, or at least claiming to believe, that he was somehow helping. A grieving father who wanted, more than anything, to protect his son's legacy from a media machine that had already proven, within days, exactly how ruthless it could be. And one quiet man in a preparation room who saw the full, unfiltered physical reality of what decades of fame, pressure, and prescription drugs can do to a human body, and who simply couldn't bring himself to describe it out loud, not for 33 years, and in the end, not ever. But that's just my read on it. The real answer, the actual answer, the one written in ink inside that sealed file, is still sitting in a vault somewhere in Tennessee, waiting for 2027. Whatever's actually in there might confirm every theory we've talked about today. It might quietly put every single one of them to rest. Or, and honestly, this might be the most likely outcome of all, it might just confirm exactly what the toxicology reports already told us decades ago in cold, clinical language, without a single hint of mystery attached to it. Either way, in a few short years, for the first time in half a century, the public will finally get to read the words for themselves, instead of relying on second-hand statements, stolen photographs, and one unfinished sentence from a man who took his real answer to the grave with him. If this deep dive into one of history's most tightly sealed mysteries kept you hooked, make sure you subscribe, because we've got plenty more cases just like this one waiting to be unpacked. Let me know down in the comments what you think is actually sitting inside that vault, and whether you think 2027 is finally going to give us real answers, or just another set of questions to argue about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.